Hi, everybody. Sandy, I think we're ready to go.
Okay. I want to welcome everyone to this webinar on why there are no George Floyds in Cuba. This event, as you know, is sponsored by the Minnesota-Cuba Committee, the U.S.-Cuba Normalization Committee, and Mass Action to Jail Killer Cops. A massive change in consciousness about police brutality has developed as a result of the murder of George Floyd and a 9.5-minute video that went viral. Some 28 million people all over the U.S. in large cities and small rural towns demonstrated last summer, and polls show a dramatic increase in the numbers of people who now say that Black and brown people are treated differently by the cops than white people. Well, the focus of the fight here, of course, is on convicting the cops. There is a lot of discussion about how we can fix this problem, from legislative proposals to community control to defunding the police. And Cuba has provided numerous examples for social justice advocates around the world of what a revolution can do to expand healthcare, education, rights for oppressed people, and more. And we have long held up Cuba's example. So we thought a discussion of police brutality that compared what we experience in the United States and other capitalist countries to what happens in Cuba would be useful. So the program we're going to present today includes 5 10-minute presentations from our guest speakers. And then participants who have questions and comments can type them in the Q&A box that's down at the bottom of your screen. If you can't find that, then you can put it in the chat, but hopefully you can find the Q&A box. And then John Waller is going to be monitoring and compiling those comments and questions. And at the end of the presentations and announcements, we will have a 45-minute discussion where those will be addressed. So we'll be watching the time so that we can complete this program and have the discussion, and appreciate the speakers' efforts to keep their remarks within the 10-minute time limit. So now I want to introduce the co-chair of this webinar, Aza Rojbi. Aza is a North African social justice and anti-racism activist. She's an organizer with the U.S.-Cuba Normalization Committee, and she's a member of the editorial board of Fire This Time newspaper. Aza?
Thank you, Sandy, for the introduction. And I will go ahead and introduce you, my fellow co-chair for tonight. Sandy Sherman is a member of the Minnesota-Cuba Committee and an activist in the fight for justice for George Floyd, Philando Castillo, Jamar Clark, among many others. She's also a former member of AFSCME Local 3800. Thank you, Sandy, and I'm very honored to be moderating this very important webinar with you here today. I wanted to say some words about the webinar. I think the final words of George Floyd, I can't breathe, repeated more than 20 times, while a white Minneapolis police officer, Derek Chauvin, pressed his knees into Floyd's neck for over 9 minutes. This horrific killing of George Floyd ignited mass anti-police brutalities protests. And as Sandy mentioned, they were all over the United States, Canada, and even around the world. More than 1,700 cities and towns in all 50 states in the US took the streets for justice for George Floyd, and hundreds of cities worldwide. And it's very unfortunate that another Black person had to die in a very inhuman and brutal act by a racist police officer to bring the world's attention back to police brutality and racism in the United States. We have to remember what Malcolm X said once: it's the same as has been always, that police sees every Black person as a criminal suspect. While the whole world saw the neck of a Black man under the pressure of the knee of the horrific police officer, Derek Chauvin, this has become a clear symbol of 400 years of racism, 400 years of Black people's knees under the racist system of the US ruling class. And this webinar today comes in this very important time where we see the trial of the killer cop, Derek Chauvin. It's a very important conversation to have here today about racism and police brutality in the United States. And also what an important conversation for us to have about what a small island of 11.5 million people called Cuba can teach us. And here I'm gonna steal a quote, or I'm gonna quote from Professor August NIMTZ's article, which is also titled "Why There Are No George Floyds in Cuba." And the quote goes, "For those who fault America's original sin for George Floyd's murder, Cuba teaches that history is not destiny," end quote. So thank you all for joining us here today for this very important webinar, this very important conversation. We have an amazing panel of speakers. I will take only 1 second of your time to explain in Spanish for folks that need translation. Today's webinar is going to be streamed in English and in Spanish. And so if you are going to be listening in English, you are in the right room. There's nothing you need to say.
Escuchando en inglés, no tiene que hacer
And
nada.
so, I think I hear, okay. So if you are here, don't worry. If you need to listen to the English, you're in the right room. But if you need to listen in Spanish, I'm gonna give the explanation of how to get there en español, por supuesto. Para activar la interpretación en computadoras por español, buscan el icono con forma de globo. Al hacer clic, se despliega un menú. Selecciona allí su idioma, por supuesto, español. En celulares y tablets, busquen la opción Interpretación de idiomas en el menú. Seleccionen su idioma y dan clic a Listo. Esto último es muy importante, si no, no se activa. En todos los dispositivos tienen la opción de silenciar el audio original para escuchar solo la voz del intérprete. Thank you everybody for joining us here today, and I'm going to pass the virtual mic back to my co-moderator, Sandy. Sandy, I think you are still on mute.
I thought I unmuted myself. Thank you, Aza. It's a pleasure. It's been a pleasure meeting you and working with you. And it's an honor for me to be part of this webinar. So I'm to introduce our first speaker, who is August NIMTZ. He's the co-chair of the Minnesota-Cuba Committee, and he's a professor of political science at the University of Minnesota. So August, unmute yourself.
Thanks, Sandy. First, on behalf of the Minnesota-Cuba Committee, I want to thank Ambassador PEDROSO for being with us. It's an honor to have you here and to be on another panel with you. I also extend thanks to all of the other participants, and especially to Allison Bodine and John Waller of the U.S.-Cuba Normalization Committee for making this webinar possible. Let me begin with a statistic from public television ad a week ago. Quote, "Police have shot and killed roughly 1,000 people in the United States every year for the past 5 years," unquote. Though most of those killed are armed, according to the police, scores of them, dozens of them are not. These are the data just for the last 5 years, when they were first collected by the Washington Post. There is no evidence, even from the most vociferous enemies of the Cuban Revolution, such as the US government, that a comparable number of Cuban civilians are killed each year by their police. When some of us say, quote, "there are no George Floyds in Cuba," unquote, this is the phenomenon we are pointing to. This is what we mean. These are the numbers we are referring to when we say that nothing like this exists in Cuba. The majority of those killed by the police in the United States are working people in white skin, white people or Caucasians. At the same time, working people in black and brown skin are disproportionately represented amongst the 1,000 killed each year. George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were two of them in 2020. So how does one explain such different realities, separated by only 90 miles of ocean water? The reason is that the Cubans have had since January 1959 a government that actually represents the interests of working people in all of their skin colors and other identities. What has yet to happen here? Let me explain. Before 1959, the police in Cuba were notorious. Police killings of civilians was the norm. And that only increased after 1953, the beginning of the Cuban Revolution. From 1953 until 1959, approximately 30,000 Cuban civilians out of a population of 5 million were murdered by the police. One of the things a parent feared the most was to go to the police station in search of a son and being told, after telling them his name, quote, "se llamaba," unquote, meaning that's what he used to be called. No wonder that millions of Cubans took to the streets in support of the executions after 1959 of some of the most heinous of the police who were captured and tried. But how did that happen? Why was it possible to carry out revolutionary justice? To paraphrase Che Guevara, to have revolutionary justice, you have to have a revolution. The triumph of the Cuban Revolution on January 1st, 1959, was preceded by 25 months of armed struggle led by Fidel Castro to overthrow the bloody US-backed Batista regime. Whenever the rebel army liberated an area, it had to establish a government to replace the old one. Thus, along with social services like education and healthcare, a police force was established. But to be effective, it had to have, unlike the old police force, the full support and the cooperation of the local population. The policing of the area had, in other words, to involve the locals. Otherwise, it would not have worked. Thus began the remaking from the bottom up of the Cuban police. This practice informed the rebel army when it forced Batista to flee the island on 31 December 1958. In collaboration with the underground, the July 26 movement, a general strike took place the following day. Key to its success was the seizure of police stations, a relatively easy and bloodless operation, owing precisely to the mass character of the general strike. Rank and file police surrendered or tried to blend into the crowds after taking off their uniforms. Listen to what the New York Times reported on January the 6th, 1959. Quote, "No police are on the streets since they are being held in quarters, and all officers are under arrest. A few police patrol cars are circulating, occupied by 2 policemen and 2 members of the rebel militia. Boy Scouts are directing traffic in some places," unquote. Thus began the simultaneous top-down, bottom-up reinvention of Cuba's police. The rebel army commander who headed up the police in the liberated areas became the national head of Cuba's new police force. The intimate collaboration between the rebel army and the local population to police an area generalized to the entire country. The Cuban masses began, as I sometimes like to say, the Cuban masses began installing a new operating system, not just a new app. beginning on New Year's Day, 1959. Many argue that what happened to George Floyd can be traced to America's original sin, chattel slavery. That argument sounds convincing. For example, in Brazil, where the police kill civilians with impunity on a daily basis, especially Brazilians with visible roots in Africa, Brazil also had centuries of chattel slavery. And what the police do in Brazil is at least 10 times worse than what the police do in the United States, reminiscent of Batista's Cuba. But the original sin argument is inadequate. Cuba also had chattel slavery, in fact, longer than the United States. In theory, then, the George Floyd phenomenon ought to exist in Cuba, as it does in Brazil, but it doesn't. It doesn't because the Cubans made a revolution that put an end to the George Floyd phenomenon. In the 3 cases in the Americas where chattel slavery was long in place, in only one of them is the George Floyd phenomenon absent. What a difference a revolution makes. Is there a better explanation? I am not ignoring the impact of chattel slavery in Cuba's history. My point is that history isn't destiny. Cuba teaches again that we're not prisoners of history. A recent article in the Cuban newspaper Juventud Rebelde, written in recognition of International Anti-Racial Discrimination Day, March 21st. By the way, how many of us in the United States know that date? An article in Juventud Rebelde addressed honestly the continuing challenges for eliminating racist ideas and practices in Cuba. That there is greater consciousness in Cuba today about the problems bodes well for a solution. But one thing is certain: when a Cuban of African descent with visible roots in Africa encounters the police, that encounter is not as life-threatening as it is here in the United States. I know that personally.
Excuse me, August, 2 minutes,
Thank you.
please.
I know that personally from my visits to Cuba since 1983. A Black Cuban has a better chance of staying alive after such an encounter than his or her counterpart in the United States. The data, the numbers make that clear. In fact, nowhere in the Americas is someone of African origin less likely to die at the hands of the police than in Cuba. Nowhere else. And the reason? Exactly because Cuba is the only country in the Americas where the working class is in power. Again, what a revolution makes possible. Let me end by noting another example of what a difference a working class revolution makes. I'm referring to how the Cuban government has responded to the pandemic in telling contrast to the US government. A Cuban with roots in Africa has a better chance of surviving COVID-19 than their counterpart in the United States. It's an example we can discuss during the question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor August. And I really appreciate your article, and I appreciate your talk today. And I think it's a very important conversation to have. And I'm sorry I quoted you. I stole one of your quotes right before you. But I thought it was a very, very important and strong quote to start today's webinar with. So thank you for your words.
Thank
And I'm very excited to invite our next speaker. Our next speaker is AISLINN PULLEY. AISLINN is a co-founder of Black Lives Matter Chicago, and she's also the executive director of the Chicago Torture Justice Center. Welcome, AISLINN.
Thank you all so much for having me. And first, I want to apologize for participating in this webinar from my car. Right now, I am at an action at Cook County Jail. Today, April 11th, holds unique significance in Chicago. April 11th is the day that Nicholas Lee died in Cook County Jail from COVID. His wife, Cassandra, called over 130 times to try to get him help before he died. And so this is the 1-year anniversary of his death in Cook County Jail. A year ago, exactly a year ago, Chicago Cook County Jail was cited as the #1 hotspot of COVID in the country. And we know that detention centers and all places of incarceration are petri dishes for COVID. The United States has done an abysmal job of preventing COVID transmission and has led the world both in COVID deaths from a civilian standpoint as well as from an incarcerated standpoint. The tragedy is further exemplified by the fact that of the statistics that we know, 1 in 5 people incarcerated have been infected with COVID, and that's only of the statistics we know. And as of April 6th, a total of 392,595 people have been officially counted as having been infected with COVID. We know that that number is not accurate. We know that that is only of the official numbers of the institutions who have submitted numbers. Not all institutions have been submitting numbers. In Illinois, for example, the Illinois Department of Corrections stopped updating their numbers. And so we don't have an accurate count of everyone who has died. April 11th is also another heartbreaking anniversary date. April 11th, 2016, 16-year-old Pierre Lori was shot and killed by Chicago police officer Sean Hitz. Pierre was killed just blocks away from Homan Square. And Homan Square is a Black site in Chicago where between 2004 and 2011, at least 7,000 people were disappeared. We know that statistic only because the Guardian newspaper, a publication out of the United Kingdom, sued and had to sue for those numbers. And those numbers only represent that finite period of time. So the true number is actually not known. The true number is much larger than that, possibly 20,000. And so today, while discussing while there are no George Floyds in Cuba, it is also resonant, particularly here in Chicago, to discuss and to add to that list why there are no Nicholas Lees in Cuba, why there are no Pierre Loris in Cuba, why there are no Laquan McDonalds in Cuba, why there are no Ahmaud Arbery's in Cuba. And unfortunately, the death toll created by systemic violence, by state violence in the United States, and particularly in Chicago, has not ceased. Within the last 30 days, CPD has killed 3 young people. Adam Toledo, who was only 13 years old, was shot and killed just less than 2 weeks ago. Anthony Alvarez, 22 years old, was shot and killed just blocks from his house by a Chicago Police Department. Trayvon Chadwell, just 18 years old, was shot and killed right in front of his apartment as well. And these statistics are heartbreaking because we know that this level of systemic violence is going to continue because the mechanisms that are necessary to eradicate this type of violence have not yet been made possible, have not yet happened. We are seeing slight reductions in killings, but that's not enough. We don't want simply reductions. We want to eliminate the root cause. And the root cause is US capitalism. What August just talked about hits the nail on the head with how and why the United States is so particularly violent to its population. Why the United States has the largest incarcerated population in the world today and in history. And the reason why the United States has the largest population is also linked to the underlying reasons why the United States also leads the world in COVID deaths. Both of those percentages are 25%. The United States holds 25% of the global deaths due to COVID and holds 25% of the world's incarcerated population. Yet, the United States is only 4.25% of the global population. The reason for this is why Cuba led and won a socialist revolution against the United States. It was to save the lives of its population. It was to create a country, to create a system that is not built on the exploitation, murder, torture of its population to enact and extract wealth for a tiny, tiny few, but to create a system where the resources and the wealth of the soil are equally distributed throughout the country, and where what people actually need to survive is administered and is given priority. And we see that in so many ways. That is made true by the fact that COVID has been relatively, people have has been a drop in the bucket of deaths in Cuba in comparison to the United States. We see that in how the vaccine is being distributed in Cuba versus the horrendous distribution efforts that are happening here in the United States. In Chicago alone, we can see how segregation continues throughout, even in the distribution of the vaccine. The first people who are being distributed are in the wealthy white centers of the city. Meanwhile, the majority of people dying are Black people who live in the poorest sections of the city. Even with the distribution of the vaccine, we see how the system fails to reach the most vulnerable and the people most in need. And the reason we have no George Floyds in Cuba, the reason we have no Laquan McDonald's, we have no Trayvon Martins, is because of the Socialist Revolution. And that must be clear now for us fighting in the United States. We have many, many proposals for reform on the table that have come up. We have many people who have become celebrity, quote unquote, activists, right? Who are in the media. But we must be very, very clear that it is the entire organization of this system that conspires to murder and super exploit and torture our population. It is not an accident. And that is why we must look to the lessons of the Cuban Revolution and be inspired that we too—
AISLINN, just to let you know, you have 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. That we too can create the world we need to live in. That we too can have no more George Floyds and no more Nicholas Lees and no more Rekia Boyds and no more Adam Toledos and no more families suffering from the immense amount of state violence that is routine in the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you, AISLINN. That was really a powerful presentation. I appreciate it. I have the distinct honor and privilege of introducing Ambassador Pedro Luis Pedroso CUESTA. Pedroso CUESTA, he is the permanent representative of Cuba to the United Nations. And a little bit more about him, he's a graduate of the Raul Roa Garcia Higher Institute of International Relations, and he holds a master's degree in national defense. He was a member of the Cuban delegations to several sessions of the United Nations General Assembly, numerous international meetings and conferences, such as the UN Conference on Environment and Development and on Small Island Developing Nations. He extensively participated in climate change negotiations, and he served as Deputy Director of Multilateral Affairs and Director General of Multilateral Affairs and International Law at the Cuban Foreign Ministry. He was appointed Ambassador of Cuba to the Republic of Kenya and Permanent Representative of the United Nations Environment Program and UN Habitat. He also served as Permanent Representative of the Republic of Cuba to the United Nations Office at Geneva and other international organizations with the rank of Ambassador. So again, I'm honored to present to you Ambassador. You can begin to speak now. Thank you.
Ambassador, I think you are muted still.
Please unmute.
Oh, I'm very sorry. Thank you very much, Sandy, and good afternoon, colleagues. First of all, allow me to thank U.S.-Cuba Normalization Organization, Minnesota Cuba Coalition, and others for convening this important conversation to address such significant and urgent topic as racism and racial discrimination. I also thank you for inviting me to share with you some elements of Cuba's experience in confronting this scourge. In Cuba, the struggle against racism and racial discrimination is inseparably linked to our struggles for independence and true emancipation. First against Spanish colonialism, and then against imperialism inside and outside Cuba. And we will have to go back to history. There is a common thread in the thinking of our heroes and main leaders, which largely explain the principled position taken by Cuba in this matter. When Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, the father of the homeland, rose up in arms against the Spanish power in October 1868, he freed his slaves and encouraged them to join the struggle for independence. He understood that colonialism and slavery were synonyms. Later, in 1893, Jose Marti, our national hero, would write, and I quote, "Men are more than whites, mulattoes, or blacks. Cubans are more than whites, mulattoes, or blacks. On the battlefield, dying for Cuba, the souls of whites and blacks have risen together into the air. In the daily life of defense, loyalty, brotherhood, and cleverness, a black man has always been there next to each white man." End of quote. This is the thinking that explains the anti-racist and egalitarian essence of Fidel's revolution, which, as of 1959, carried out radical transformation to eliminate the structural foundations of institutional racism and racial discrimination in the country. It is also the reason why my country supported, at great sacrifices and risk, the national liberation struggles in Africa and joined the fight against the disgraceful anti-apartheid regime. Dear friends, for Cuba, it is a source of national pride to be a monoethnic and mixed race nation, which is a stronghold of our identity. We are a country with Indo-American, European, African, and Asian blood. The vast majority of our population is a mixed race, as are our traditions, idiosyncrasy, religiosity, and folk culture. The African heritage that enriches our identity is not limited to those who genetically descend from the 300,000 slaves brought to Cuba by colonialism, nor it is assumed as an element of differentiation or segmentation with respect to other groups. It is a fundamental component of everything that is considered Cuban. That is why the fight against racism and racial discrimination has been a permanent task in the country with undeniable successes. In 62 years of socialist revolution, much has been accomplished in favor of the full equality of all the people and in terms of the fight against racism and racial discrimination. It was the revolution with its profound humanistic approach which wiped out forever all types of racial segregation in the country and which democratized the access to education and culture as a shield against racism and racial discrimination. It was also the revolution which created and has permanently strengthened a robust legal and institutional framework to ensure the right of all individuals to full equality. This right even includes criminal protection, which with severe penalties for those who attempt to infringe it. The work of the revolution has made it possible to guarantee that all persons are equal before the law, receive the same protection and treatment from the authorities, and enjoy the same rights, liberties, and opportunities without discrimination, which is banned and punished by law. There is no discrimination based on skin color in the access to public services and the institutions that provide them. Decent employment and social security and assistance, the administration of justice, and the due protection by law enforcement agencies. Nor there is discrimination in the access to top state and government positions or on the representations in them. Some figures speak for themselves. The 2012 population census showed that 35.9% of the Cuban population describe themselves as non-white. At the same time, it accounts for 41% of the National Assembly of People's Power, our parliament, whose president, as well as the vice president of the Republic, the president of the People's Supreme Court, the Attorney General of the Republic, and the Minister of Justice are Black or mixed race people. Likewise, the new Constitution of the Republic, endorsed in 2019 by 85.86% of the voters in a popular referendum, ratified and strengthened the recognition and protection of the right to equality, as well as the prohibition of discrimination. Nevertheless, as you know, no country has managed to completely to eradicate all expressions of racism and racial discrimination. In our case, despite the tremendous progress made in this field, racial prejudices still linger on the behavior and expression of some people, which are based on historical, social, and cultural factors. These prejudices and expressions are unacceptable and are not consistent with the country's inclusive and participatory model we are building. Hence, we are determined to continue to move forward until their complete elimination. To that end, and with the purpose of having an updated and comprehensive work tool readily available to solve this problem, in November 2019, the National Program Against Racism and Racial Discrimination was approved, which is coordinated by a government commission headed by the President of the Republic himself. Its objectives include identifying the causes of discrimination, diagnosing potential actions to be carried out by territory and area of society, disseminating more visible our African heritage, and encouraging public debate on the racial problem, including in the mass media. These efforts are in line with our obligations as a state party to the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the commitments undertaken in the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, and the shared objectives of the International Decade for People of African Descent. In this connection, we will continue to move forward on this area, despite our status as a small developing country, and despite the serious impact of the criminal, economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed by the United States government for over 6 decades, which has been intensified in an unprecedented way in times of pandemic. Dear friends, in closing, I would like to end by answering the question that serves as the topic of this event. In Cuba, there are no George Floyds for the simple reason that there have a socialist revolution which has placed the dignity of all human beings at the center of its economic, social, and political endeavors. In like manner, I would like to reiterate that Cuba will always join the efforts of the international community aimed at doing away with racism and all forms of racial discrimination as part of our objective is to achieve a fair world for all. I thank you very much.
Gracias, gracias, Ambassador. Thank you, Ambassador Pedro Luis Pedroso, for your words with us here today. And I want to go next and invite up our next speaker. Our next panelist with us is Kimberly Washington. Kimberly is a longtime Black rights activist and a participant in the 2019 Venceremos Brigade trip to Cuba. Welcome, Kimberly.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank you all for having me, and hope I can add value after these phenomenal panelists. I was born and raised here in the north side of Minneapolis, and we grew up with my mother and my stepfather literally were adamant about not encountering the police for only 2 reasons. The first was, you will not be a criminal in our home or what have you. If you are, you go to jail, you stay in jail. But the second and most important reason was, if you have an encounter with the police, first of all, you want to avoid them at all possible costs, hence don't be a criminal. But secondly, you want to avoid them because you would either wind up beat up or dead. They didn't need a reason to basically, they had a place down by the river where they would take you and beat you up. And it didn't matter if you were male or female, but you're Black, you're poor. We lived in the projects, and we tried to avoid them at all possible costs. And so, which was definitely, I tried to as much as possible. But I actually have a brother who he worked at, it was Flower City, and Flower City is actually right by the 3rd precinct, and he took a bus to work every day, and he actually had a transfer, and in the wintertime he would get off the bus downtown and he would walk through the IDS Center and then go to catch his other bus, and he would try to wait in the IDS Center, but he literally would get stopped constantly by the police and harassed constantly by the police because he was walking through the IDS Center at the regular time, same time every day. And it was just a really terrible experience for him. And eventually he bought a car and got married, and he actually married a Caucasian woman. And one day he was driving her car, which was still in her father's name, and the address was in Edina. And the police stopped him and roughed him up significantly and took him down to the county jail because they're like, why are you driving this white person's car? You must have stolen this person's car. And it was she just hadn't changed the car's address from Edina to Northside where they lived. And it's like all these constant experiences that we've had to deal with just in our own family. But what really made me more active was we had an event in my apartment building where one guy was chasing another guy in the building, and we called the police, and the police came in, or somebody called the police. I actually didn't call the police, but the police came in, and this guy actually was he was the one being chased, and it was a Black man, and he started to have an asthma attack, and he asked for an ambulance. He didn't say ambulance, but you knew that he said he wanted an ambulance, and he said ambulance. And the police actually took him outside, and people kept calling, asking for help for this gentleman, and the police kept calling and canceling, and he ended up actually convulsing to death right outside our door, which is a horrific thing to see. And that actually got me motivated to start doing anti-police brutality work. In addition to, there were several other events, the Tyson Nelson killing and what have you. But so I began work in this anti-police brutality sphere. But one of the things I want to fast forward, I travel a lot. And one of the things I realized when I travel, I try to never do, I do the touristy things, but usually when I go places or what have you, I try to take the city bus wherever I am, or take the public transportation, hang out with the people. And I always ask them about what life is like wherever they are. And one of the things I have realized is that people in other places other than the United States typically people from the United States, we think we're the center of the universe. Literally the center of the universe. Whereas opposed to, you go someplace else and everyone else looks at themselves in relationship to the world. They will ask you questions about what is going on in the United States. They think they care about water and the environment and climate. So fast forward to 2019, when I was on the Venceremos Brigade, then my behavior, or asking people all the time, whenever we went out into the public, into Havana, and encountered the Cuban people, I would ask them things about, how do you view the world? Why do you think things are different in the United States? And it was really interesting because, first of all, Cubans' perspective is, we are surviving the revolution. We are working towards the revolution. We want a better world for everyone. It's not just about us. It is about me and my neighbor. And it's about, how can we make our society better? And actually, they all have a common enemy, which is the United States. And it's not to their benefit to fight amongst each other. It's not to their benefit to allow the police officers to treat people of one color a different way. It's, we're in this, there's a unity that you don't see here. And I actually have a really good friend who I went to high school with, and we've remained friends, and he is a police officer. And one of the things that, even as a police officer, he's African-American, and one of the things as a police officer is, when they stop training to be from, hurt people, to shoot, it was to shoot to kill. And you shoot to kill, you have to protect yourself. And I always tell people that here in the United States, that the police officers operate out of fear. They don't, it's us versus them mentality. And if we have this whole legacy of, it's them, we need to oppress them, we need to keep them down, we need to keep them relegated to a certain area of the city. And that's what we have to do, is us versus them. So if you have this mindset of us versus them, then you're not going to care whether you kill them or not. You're not going to care. You have to keep them in their place, and you have to keep them in a position where, if we don't care about their lives. And you didn't see that. I didn't see that in Cuba. I didn't see that in Cuba. When you ask people about police brutality, we were in a cab one night in Havana, and the cab driver, we were asking him about police brutality, and he's like, we have no idea what that is. I mean, we know what it is because of what the people in the United States experience, because we try to make ourselves aware. But I as an Afro-Cuban, and because he was an Afro-Cuban, do not have to worry about if I encounter the police, if something is going to happen to me, or if I'm going to be exercising and I'm going to be shot, or if a white Cuban comes up to me and is going to accost me because I am Black in their neighborhood. It's a completely different experience. And I found that really interesting, and it was really hard to come back
Excuse
to.
me, Kimberly, just to let you know, these 2 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, great. But for me, it was really hard to come back, and especially in 2020, and to see all the killings. Tamar Rice is the one that is really difficult for me. Like, I have nightmares to this day. And you know that there's a place 90 miles from the United States where you can walk the street and not be afraid. You can drive and not be afraid. And I have one thing that was really interesting that happened to me last summer after George Floyd. I bowled with a group of ladies, and we were doing a summer league, and it was way out in St. Paul in some suburb, Little Canada. And we decided to go to one lady's house, and it was very interesting because she's like, do you guys know how to get to my house from here? And I didn't. She's like, okay, you can follow me. And all the ladies are Caucasian except for myself. So she takes out from the bowling alley, and she's driving 50 miles an hour down this 30-mile-an-hour road. And I'm just like, I can't do that. I can't do that. And so when I finally get to her house, everybody's there. They're all driving all fast and everything. And she says, well, what happened to you? And I was like, I'm Black. I'm Black. What do you not realize that I'm Black? And she said, what do you mean? And I said, I can't, I am in this white suburb. I'm a Black person. I cannot be driving down the street 50 miles an hour. I do not want to be the next George Floyd. And the light bulb that resonated, like the light bulb went off, and it like this, she had seen the George Floyd thing. She thought it was horrific, but it was like, literally until I told her that I live in fear every single day as a Black woman. I don't want to be stopped by the officers. She literally wasn't going to do anything. But then the next weeks, she and her daughter got out and they began to protest. But it wasn't until she had that personal experience that she realized that this is the fear that we as Black people live in every day. So it was a learning experience, and I helped, affect change in one person, but it's definitely, and I know the one thing, it is because of our capitalistic society, and that it's different in Cuba because of the change in the system. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. I really appreciate those comments and your personal story. And now our next speaker, our final speaker on the panel, is Sophia Elijah. She's an attorney, and she's a former law professor at Harvard and CUNY School of Law.
Thank you. First, I want to say thank you for inviting me to participate on this panel. It's quite an honor to be with such esteemed co-panelists. I'm particularly pleased, humbled, and thrilled to be able to hear the ambassador speak. I've heard such wonderful things about you, sir. I first traveled to Cuba back in 1986. And I think it's fair to say that about 15 minutes after landing at the airport, I fell in love with the country. It's probably my only addiction. And I have been to Cuba over 90 times by now. I have studied the criminal justice system and the prison system extensively as a law professor. And I was struck by how radically different those systems are and how they are framed to support the revolution and to support the people. It took me quite a while to understand the difference because I kept trying to draw analogies to the US system. So I would say after maybe 10 visits, I finally got it out of my blood that you just couldn't draw those analogies, because what Cuba was building was something that was unique and building a better world for all people. And as I would hear President Fidel Castro say, a better world is possible, I finally started to get the depth and the breadth of what those words meant. And as I would travel all around the country, I was amazed. It was the first time in my life that I actually thought I understood what it meant to be free, that it was safe to walk around. I didn't have to worry about anybody, whether they wore a uniform or not, to disturb my peace just because of the color of my skin. It was a very different experience than my lifetime in the United States. But I continued to wonder where the police were hiding in Cuba, because I didn't see any arrests. I would see the police seeming to have conversations with lay people. It appeared to me they were talking about maybe a baseball game, or maybe about the weather, or maybe even the traffic. But I didn't see what I was used to as an arrest in the United States, which was physical brutality, people being thrown on the ground, people being thrown against walls, humiliated, called all kinds of nasty names. I kept wondering where those police were, where did those experiences happen, and how come the police didn't arrest anybody? So in my convoluted US indoctrination, I started to think, well, maybe the police didn't do the arrest, maybe the military did the arrest, but then where were they hiding? Because I still hadn't seen any arrests. So finally, I gathered the courage to ask some of my Cuban friends, who I thought wouldn't laugh me out of the country, like, how come the police don't arrest anybody? And they said, oh, Sophie, what are you talking about? The police arrest people. Why would you think the police don't arrest people? And I said, well, I've been here a lot now, and I've gone all around the country, and I haven't seen any arrests. So they said, okay, we're going to go out with you the next day. We'll walk around Havana. And then they were pointing out, see, it's right over there. That's an arrest. And that was those conversations that to me looked like there was a discussion about a baseball game. But there was no violence. There was no tension. There was no physical or verbal confrontation. And I just couldn't wrap my brain around the possibility that there could be an arrest minus those things, that there could be respect coming from law enforcement. That was foreign concept in the United States. Well, it was a foreign concept in my section of the United States. When I was teaching at Harvard Law School, and most of the students I was teaching were children of the oppressor, as I would say, well-meaning, but still children of the oppressor, I realized that they had a very different experience with the police. Even if they were stopped, it was that friendly kind of baseball-looking encounter that I'd seen in Cuba. But that wasn't the experience in my community in the United States. So it highlighted further something that I knew for decades, long before I became a criminal defense lawyer, that there's two very, very different systems of so-called justice in the United States. One is spelled Justice, and the other is spelled Just-US. And so it was that latter one that I was very familiar with. And I was relieved to find that part of the accomplishments and triumphs of the Cuban Revolution was that all of its citizens could enjoy the first spelling of the word justice. And that was very clearly rooted in what the ambassador mentioned and Professor August mentioned, which is that the people are at the center of the entire country. Even the criminal justice system and the prison system are all designed to enable people to improve and return back to their communities as quickly as possible so they can be contributing members of society. That there's no economic benefit, there's no financial gain from locking up what the Cubans recognize as their most valuable natural resource, which is its people. Unlike in the United States, where there's a whole economy built around putting people in cages. So as I started to draw those distinctions, I was mesmerized by the various programs that Cuba kept implementing that would provide people with ways to get out of prison sooner. And every time I would go back for another visit to Cuba, thinking that I had mastered an understanding of the program that I had learned about in my previous trip, and then I would try to show off my knowledge, I would talk to my Cuban friends and other professors, and they would say, oh no, we've moved past that, Sophie, now we're doing this, which was even more mind-boggling and even more progressive and even more people-centered than before. So as I learned more and more, I started infusing those different ideas into my teaching to my students. So I learned, and I'm very, very clear about now, we can't build a better world in the US until we are able to take off the blinders, until we're able to appreciate, and to the point that Kimberly was making earlier, till we recognize the frightening ignorance and arrogance that we're infused with in the United States, where we fail to understand that there are other places that are doing a much better job, and that there's a lot that we could learn from studying those other places. You know, from time to time, I speak at different prisons and I share with the people who are incarcerated some of the experiences and programs that Cuba has instituted that are so much more people-centered. Things like allowing people,
I
2
just
minutes?
minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Things like allowing people to go out on furloughs, things like determining the security level of someone's incarceration by how many weekends a month they can go home to their family. It's like unheard of in the United States. But when you think about those things, that is how people continue to feel connected to their communities and how they can come back to their communities as whole people and not stigmatized and not destroyed. I'd like to say to my fellow activists in the United States that we have to change our language in many ways. And one of the things that we have to change is this concept of criminal justice reform and prison reform. These systems are so geared towards destroying people. And it's not just the police, it is the vigilante police. It's the KKK, it's those people who took over the Capitol on January 6th. They're all in cahoots together. So we can't reform these systems. They're beyond reform. They're no more able to be reformed than slavery. And we have to be vigilant in our determination to completely overhaul them. It's not about reform, and build a society that centers its people as the most valuable asset that this country has to offer. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our last speaker, Sophia. Thank you for your words. And I want to thank all the panelists for their really very inspiring and very educational presentations with a lot of personal stories that I think I just realized my camera is off. I apologize. You were probably all just seeing my big name up in the screen. And so again, thank you all for our speaker today. Before we get to the Q&A section, I want to remind everybody that you can post your questions in the chat box, which is at the bottom of your screen. And so feel free to post a question for any of the panelists or for all of them. We are also looking at the chat. If you can't find the Q&A box, you can also post your question in the chat, but the Q&A box will be best if you can find it. Thank you. And before getting there, we're going to make some few announcements about different Cuba Solidarity events that are taking place. And because it's important that we learn from Cuba, and in learning from Cuba, it's important to stand with Cuba against the United States blockade, this unjust and cruel policy against Cuba, hindering the development of Cuba. And so we're standing with Cuba, we stand against the blockade. And a big important campaign that I wanted to share with all of you is the Syringes for Cuba campaign. This is a campaign by the Saving Lives campaign that is launching it as a major initiative to raise money to send syringes to Cuba for its plan to vaccinate its entire population against COVID-19 using its own vaccines. I'm sure you've seen in the news that Cuba has developed 5 internationally recognized vaccines that they are in different stages of trials. And 2 of them are in phase 3 clinical trials as of April 2021 and getting near to approval. So this very important Saving Lives campaign is a fundraiser appeal, and it's initially appealing to fundraise for $75,000 to send 2.5 million syringes to help with Cuba's vaccination campaign. And if it is successful in reaching its target, and which we believe we will with the support of all of you, we can send even more syringes to help Cuba and support their vaccination campaigns. And I want to add that I, as myself here in Vancouver, Canada, the Canadian Network on Cuba has also run here in Canada a very successful campaign that started and that was able to collect over $60,000 of donations. And we were able to get a 40-foot container of over 1,900,000 syringes that we are sending here from Canada to support Cuba in its vaccination efforts. So the campaign in the United States built on the success of the campaign in Canada, but it's also very important because we need to support Cuba in this time of the blockade to be able to help them with their vaccination efforts against COVID-19. There will be a link that's going to be posted in the chat. It is for a Google form in which you can make a pledge to support the Saving Lives campaign fundraiser appeal. Thank you all. That will be something very important to do in this time of pandemic to support Cuba. Another event that I want to announce that is taking place on April 17. And again, all the information will be posted in the chat for all of you to register and make sure you know what's going on, is that the Canadian Network on Cuba will be inviting all of you for a monthly virtual picket action against the United States blockade. Again, the registration link will be posted in the chat. And I'm going to pass the virtual mic to Sandy for a few more announcements.
Okay, thank you, Elsa. On April 21st at 8 p.m. 5 Eastern Time, 5 p.m. Pacific Time, the U.S.-Cuban Normalization Committee is hosting a webinar on the Cuban literacy campaign and the Playa Girón defeat of U.S. mercenary invasion. The registration, we're going to post this link in the chat, so you can register for that. And then on April 22nd, at 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, you can join Doctors Helen Yaffe and Valia Rodriguez, producer of the film Cuba and COVID-19, in a webinar to discuss how Cuba is defeating this deadly coronavirus. And again, that registration link will be in Zoom, and I hand it back.
Thank you, Sandy. And in some ways, it's interesting to see that despite this COVID-19 pandemic and how hard it made it for a lot of us organizing, that there is a lot of momentum for Cuba solidarity activities. And so we still have a few more announcements that I think are all very important events that I encourage all of you to attend and support Cuba. And so on Sunday, April 25th, which is the last Sunday of every month, the Support Cuban Families in the US Economic Sanctions Caravans will be taking place in several cities in the US, Canada, and most likely around the world, as we've seen in the last one. It was very inspiring to see all the pictures from Havana, Cuba, of all the youth leading that care and bicycle caravan in Cuba. And so I encourage all of you, if you live in a city and an event has been announced, please post it in the chat, either in the US or Canada or anywhere around the world. Please post the information for the caravans for Cuba in the chat for others to join you. Another event taking place on April 25th at 2 p.m. Minnesota time, and it is an in-person event. It's called Why There Are No George Floyds in Cuba. It's an in-person presentation at the Trailhead, and the address for that will be posted in the chat. It's in Minneapolis, and speakers will include Professor August NIMTZ, Kimberly Washington, and Mel Reeves, who's the community editor of the Minnesota Spokesman Record and a longtime social justice activist. So I encourage all the folks that are in Minneapolis to join this event in person. It will be posted in the chat for you. And I'm going to pass it for the last announcement to my co-compañera, my co-moderator, Sandy.
Thank you, Aza. Again, on Sunday, April 25th at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific, there's going to be the Che Guevara Volunteer Work Brigade, which is a project of the Canadian Network on Cuba. They're going to have an online e-net to celebrate the 60th anniversary of Cuba's successful literacy campaign. And so that we'll put that link to that in the chat for you. And then there is a series called Perspectives from Havana in a Year of COVID and Embargo. It's a series of weekly conversations, and the first event of the series starts on April 13th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time with Cuban economist Esteban Morales. And so we'll post that link as well. So that's the end of the announcements that we were given. So again, now we can open up the question and answer period. And we will begin. The first question that we have that is directed to anyone who wants to answer it is, are there any Black rights organizations in Cuba independent of the government? If you want to speak.
Andy, if I may come to respond to that question. I mean, there is no black organization, independent black organization, as I explained. And what I feel is that sometimes people try to make an automatic, transposition of the situation. Our situation is completely different to the state. We have, of course, more than 2,000 civil society organizations independent from the state. All of them bring all our people. As I said, a large percentage of our population is considered themselves as mixed people, and inconsistent with that, there is a corresponding representation in the various bodies of governance and the state, but we don't have separate. We have, for example, the Federation of Cuban Women. So all Cuban women come together there. We have the organizations of students. All the students come together there. We don't see each other in our daily treatment, in our daily social conversation as being this one white and this one black and this one mulatto. And I need to have my own organization to defend ourselves, because after all, we have common framework where we all can have, protection. And if something come up, there is we have criminal procedure that ensures that everybody's rights is respected. So in summary, no, because it's a totally different situation. There is no need for that. As Cuban peasants, for example, come together in trying to put forward and to move their interests and concerns together. There is no the peasant, the Black Association of Peasants or the White Association of Peasants. No, it's a totally different situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I have another question that I think might also be for you, but also for everybody else. And the question is, I've heard that even though cop brutality and killings are not existing in Cuba, racial profiling of Blacks by police still occur. Is that true?
Thank you, Asa. Definitively no. I mean, in Cuba, the law enforcement agencies doesn't base their action on racial profiling. Definitively no. And I said there are laws that protect against that. I'm not saying, and as I said before, that we don't have problems, that we don't have certain issues, but those issues we have put in place mechanisms to deal with them, but certainly not the police, not any other law enforcement organization or agency in the country base their action on racial profiling. Thank you.
Does anyone else want to address that, or we can go on to the next question? Which is, how are the police in Cuba held accountable to the local population? Do they live in the neighborhood they police? That's an issue that comes up in the United States a lot, that most of the police, for example, in Minneapolis, the overwhelming majority of police don't live in Minneapolis that are policemen here. So that's the question.
I think police in Cuba, and I think it's important to understand this, as it's important to understand how people approach to government authorities. I mean, police in Cuba, as any other authority, live within the communities. Police children go to the same schools that other people take their children to. And there are the appropriate mechanisms and structures of government that ensure that not only a police, because anybody, regardless of being police or not, depending on their position in society, might be tempted to go beyond what is provided to their authority. In any case in Cuba, whoever tried to go beyond, whoever tried to violate, whoever tried to react or act against what is provided in law, there are specific mechanisms and government structures that are designed to deal with those situations. If a police violates what is stipulated in the law, certainly it would be taken to courts. I mean, there is no way that you can violate and you can treat people in disregard to what is provided in the law. And I think it's important to call the attention to something. There is an ethic in the treatment of people and in the treatment of the prisoner or people who comes under the law enforcement. And there is an ethic that start to be entrenched in our law enforcement agencies and bodies even before the revolution, because at Sierra Maestra, whenever the Ejército Rebelde took a prisoner, it was mandatory. I mean, it was a mandate by the commander-in-chief, in this case by Fidel, that prisoner had to be treated with respect, and prisoners, for example, could not be subject to torture. So that has been part of the ethic of the revolution. That has been part of the ethic of the law enforcement agencies in the country. I thank you.
If I can just add to what the ambassador said, the practice of the police being rooted in the communities from which they come and serve, that goes back to the very beginning of the revolutionary process that I was referring to. That is, when the rebel army liberated areas, when areas were liberated by the rebel army, in order to create a new police force, a credible police force, there had to be cooperation, close collaboration and cooperation with the local population. And it was that experience in the liberated areas that was generalized to the entire country beginning on January 1st, 1959.
Kimberly, I see your hands up.
Sophia was before me.
Yes, I just wanted to echo what the ambassador was saying and speak a moment about the way the situation is in the US. Here, the police are encouraged not to live in the community where they work. And that automatically creates this distance. There's I think someone referenced it earlier, us versus them kind of reality. And that's not just not the reality in Cuba. The police are part of the community in every way, which is why it was really hard for me to recognize and arrest for so long, because you're not going to beat up your neighbor's children. That's just the way it is. And the reality that having the trusted position of being a police officer in Cuba, any position of trust is very, very highly scrutinized. And to the ambassador's point, if you violate that public trust, then it is considered a major infraction, not a minor infraction, not the way that we've come to just accept in the United States, that the police get away with everything from minor infractions to murder on a regular basis. Nothing of the sort happens in Cuba. And I think unless you go there and spend a lot of time decolonizing your brain, it's from what the US has put in the air for you to breathe for decades, it's very hard to understand how very different it is. And that even the idea, and I understand the push and the movement for defunding the police, I would never whisper those words in Cuba. You have no reason to defund the police in Cuba, right? They play a very fundamental role, but they're also a very respected and honorable part of society for all members of society. And that's what I think is very hard for us in the United States to wrap our brains around.
Kimberly, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, and actually it follows with what Sophia said. And actually there were some comments, because I did, especially decolonizing your mind. People were asking, are there white Cubans? And I was like, actually, we, even in terms of asking about police brutality in Cuba, you can't get your brain around it, because they think of themselves as Cubans and not as white Cubans or Afro-Cubans. And I kept saying, even when I was asking, do the fairer skinned Cubans get treated better than the darker skinned Cubans? And they couldn't even comprehend what I was asking, because they are not experiencing it, you know what I mean? And even and when you come from Cuba and then you come back to the United States, you get back into that same mode of thinking. It's white and black, and it's just like I talked about my experience with being in a predominantly white neighborhood and not driving fast, because as a black person, you have to think about these things, and they don't have to think about those things. The darker skin Cubans don't have to think about them, because they're all Cubans and they're in this together. It's not, you can't bring your United States thinking to Cuba. You literally have to think about it. And I apologize for saying about the white Cubans, but I'm back here in the United States. So you have to literally balance how you think about, it's not apples to apples.
Can I add one more thing? You know, I've been in several of these conversations, and I'm fascinated by the fact that although the conversation and the topic is, why are there no George Floyds in Cuba? And should be a really strict critique of what happens in the United States. Every single one of these conversations that I've been in, at the end, when it's Q&A, there's all these questions of almost what I'll call virtual disbelief, that Kimberly and myself and maybe Professor August, we've drunk the Kool-Aid, that somehow when we landed in Cuba, we got the wrong mojito, and suddenly we have this distorted view of what actually happens in Cuba. And I would invite people to stop questioning what happens in Cuba, and let's focus and question what's happening in the United States. Why should we be in a situation where I cannot go to sleep at night if my son goes out, because I'm afraid that he's going to be at the end of some cop's bullet or some cop's knee. I don't want to be in any more conversations questioning the beauty of the Cuban Revolution. Let's talk about all the things that need to be fixed right here in the United States.
Thank you, Sophia. I think that's a perfect way. I think that, and it actually is a great segue to the next question that I wanted to share. And on another side note, I would encourage everybody, once the pandemic and COVID situation is out of the way, to travel to Cuba and experience it by yourself.
Exactly.
And I know either you're in the US or Canada, there's a lot of ways that you can travel it. Here in Canada, my first time was going through the Che Guevara Volunteer Work Brigade. I know in the US, you can go with the Pastors for Peace, the Venceremos Brigade, the May Day Brigade. There's a lot of ways to travel to Cuba and see Cuba and experience Cuba by yourself. So thank you for all the speakers here today. And to Sophia's point, the next question is, let's take it back to the United States and let's see what we can learn from Cuba in fighting against racism today here in the United States. And maybe I'll throw it back at you, Sophia, and August, and anybody else that has anything to add for this question.
I think the first thing I would share is the beauty of the reality that in Cuba, you can have open discussion about everything and anything. And that in the Cuban Revolution, they're always examining how can they improve it. And so you can have an open conversation about, I saw this thing happen or that thing happen. And what does that mean? Is there a way to make this better? It doesn't mean at all that you're anti-Cuban. It means that you are trying to make the revolution always better. The Cuban Revolution is not static, it's dynamic. And so it's always evolving, to the point that I was making earlier about studying the criminal justice system there. And to those who want to critique and say, there's no room for discussion, they couldn't be further from the truth. There's plenty of room for discussion and lots of participatory governance. I mean, you could take a real big page from participatory governance in Cuba and try to study how we could build that into the United States governance. But that's probably a long ways off. But in the meantime, I think that we should appreciate the fact that in Cuba, everyone in the country is engaged in a daily practice of examining and improving.
If I can just add on to what Sophia beautifully explained, and what Ozza raised about travel, the importance of travel to Cuba. The critics and the enemies of the Cuban Revolution can make their claims, unfounded claims, on the basis of the assumption that you as a citizen of the United States don't have the right to freely travel to Cuba to see the reality of Cuba for yourself. This is why they're able to make all of the kinds of claims that they make. They assume that you can't go there, and rightly, you won't be able to see a different kind of reality. So they can get away with it. They can get away with all kinds of false claims about the reality of Cuba. Sophia said something a few minutes ago that really brought that home to me. And I was in old Havana once with a Caucasian friend, and we were watching a brother who was violating a law in Cuba. You can't bother the tourists. And the Cubans are very, very clear about that. One of the reasons why being a tourist in Cuba is a very different reality than being a tourist in many other places in the Caribbean. But I saw this brother that he was actually he was violating the law. And the police stopped him and was having one of these conversations. I was trying to figure out, I thought it was about maybe an argument, a civil argument about maybe baseball or whatever is the case. And what struck me was that the brother was arguing with the police. He was acting as if he hadn't done anything. And I'm saying to myself, be careful, brother, you can't do that because I'm operating with the framework of the US. In the US reality, yeah, you just wouldn't do that. But my man stood up, he challenged the police as they slowly eased him into the police car to take him away because he was in fact violating the law.
Kimberly, would you like to add anything, or Ambassador?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting because when I was getting ready to go to Cuba, and even after I got back and I returned, quite a few people said to me, I thought you can't go to Cuba. And I was like, well, you can go to Cuba, you just have to, figure it out. And there are different ways to go to Cuba. But it was really one of the things that I found very interesting, number one, when I got there, because we had all these different presentations and everything. And people have like Sophia said, people are able to examine what you can improve in Cuban society. And people here in the United States have the impression that you can't say anything against the government, that you're on lockdown, and there is some limit to the freedom of speech. But I found it very interesting because one of the things they talked about when they're ratifying the Constitution, the number, it was over, and I tried to find it, the number, because I have it written down somewhere. I mean, it was hundreds of thousands of comments that came in through email and letters and calls to how they thought things could be improved in Cuba. And the difference is that I saw or heard about when I was there was that people actually felt like they can create change, as opposed to here. And especially my African-American brothers and sisters feel like, oh, I'm not going to comment on what's happening because nothing is going to change, because it's all about the money. And a good example is right now in the city of Minneapolis, Xcel Energy is creating their integrated resources plan, which is a 15-year plan. And they want to build another gas plant, and they're, putting down solar and wind and everything. And I work in the community primarily with African-American, Hispanic, and Somali people. And we want them to comment on this program. And most of them say to me, oh, it's not going to change. Nothing is going to happen, because really what it boils down to, which more than likely they may be right, but more than it boils down to the economics. It's not what's good for the environment, and it's not what is good for our people, especially our people of color that are the ones that are being poisoned in the environment. And they feel like they can affect that change, because it's going to boil down to whether or not the Public Utilities Commission is going to approve it, and it's what's going to be best for the Xcel shareholders. And you don't see that. I was only in Cuba one time, but everyone said it's what is best. We do what is going to be best for the Cuban people. How we lay the electricity, how we do this, how we do that. And that is and we can affect change if we talk about it. And you don't hear that. Everyone usually that I speak to here is like, oh, well, we can't do anything anyway, because if it's not going to help them make money, they're not going to do the change.
Thank you, Kimberly. Boy, is that ever true. Another question has come up that anyone can speak to. Given all the economic problems in Cuba now, how do you explain the level of support for the Cuban government?
Thank you, Sandy. I think it's important in addressing that question, which is a real one, and can be approached from different angles. But I think that one very important and important point is that most of the people in Cuba is very much aware that what we have in first is a government which is a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. So there is no a separation between what the government portrays and what people's needs are. In all circumstances, the government is engaged with the people. And if you go from the main, I mean, in this over 60 years of revolution, and when you pass through the main challenges that we have come through, you can see that in all those moments, the government and the people has been only one. I mean, there has not been separation. And that was when Bay of Pigs, for example. In Bay of Pigs was Fidel leading the people in the battlefield and the people there. When the battle for the in the 1970s, the target for the 10 million tons of Cuba, for example, that was very quite important in those moments. It was the government and the people. The voluntary work calls, for example, who was the one that pioneered the voluntary work attitude in Cuba? It was Che Guevara. It was at the top of the government. So this notion of having a government in one side and the people in the other is that doesn't work in Cuba. That doesn't work. And besides of that, I think our people, most of our people comprehend very well that the main responsible for the scarcities we have, for the economic constraints that we have, if not the policies of the government, but the embargo, the blockade that we have been facing for over 60 years. So I think the question is relevant, and the best answer that I can provide is that there is no a divorce between the people and the government. We are one in one. The government is accountable to the people by our constitution. Leaders are removed, can be removed from their position in government by the people. So that sort of separation is not there, and because people has much to say and much to lead in Cuba.
Can I add? I wholeheartedly agree with what the ambassador just said. It occurs to me that the question in some ways begs ignorance. And by that, I mean the following. One of the very first things that the revolution did was make sure that it eradicated illiteracy, and it focused on educating its people. If you go to Cuba, you find people who are the most informed, not only about what's happening in Cuba, but what's happening in the United States, in New York City, in Brooklyn, and all around the globe, because they're highly educated and informed people. In the United States, we are constantly bombarded with being dumbed down. And as a society, part of the reason that things are so problematic here is because there's so much ignorance. And then you pour in a very healthy cup of arrogance. And so you have ignorant, arrogant Americans running around thinking that they know everything. And that's why they look down on Cuba and every other country for that matter. But in Cuba, the people are very well informed, and they have the ability, because of that education, to vet and examine everything that's happening in the government. They're part of the government, and they can question and improve on what's happening in the government. So the question about, despite the economic challenges, why is there such loyalty to the country? If you had the same kind of supports in the United States for the people that you have in Cuba, then you'd have that same kind of support for the government. We don't even want to talk about the previous 4 years, but what has been problematic time and time again is people feeling like they don't actually participate in the process and that corruption runs from top to bottom. That is not the Cuban experience. I can't think of any place where people should be more committed and supportive of the government than Cuba.
Thank you, Sophia. Anybody else has, any of other speakers has anything to add? All right, I think it's time to move on to the next question, which unfortunately is going to be our last question. We've received a lot of questions. Unfortunately, due to the time, we can't get to all of them, but it's been a very important conversation and a very important webinar to have. And I encourage all of you to get involved in all the upcoming events that have been posted in the chat. And if you are in Minnesota, Minneapolis, there will be an in-person event on April 25, where this conversation, I think, will continue on there as well. So keep attending our events, keep supporting the work that's been happening in solidarity with Cuba and learning from Cuba and in the United States against police brutality. So I'm gonna go on to our last question, and then we'll do a round of closing remarks from our amazing panelists here today. And the question is for anybody on the panelists, and it is, how has the US blockade on Cuba made combating racism in Cuba more difficult or challenging? Who would like to go first, take on this question? I'm going to repeat it just in case, make sure everybody heard me. And the question is, how has the US blockade on Cuba made combating racism in Cuba more difficult or challenging?
I think in principle and very generally speaking, we can say that the US blockade in Cuba has a multidimensional effect. And by that, that prevents Cuba of focusing on issues that really we could be focusing in if we would not be suffering the blockade, if we would not been in a situation that every time, at all time, we have to be devising and focus on how to deal and how to prevent a higher impact from the blockade. There are a number of issues that we can be engaged in, but unfortunately we cannot be focused on, because we have to divert more attention at how we can deal with the blockade. And this not only has to do with racism and racial discrimination, but with other social challenges that we have in every aspect of our lives. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Anyone else from our panelists would like to add anything? All right, if not, I will keep it for you as a question that you can address in your closing remarks as well. And maybe for the closing, we will start the opposite way from where we started. Maybe I'll pass it on to Sophia Elijah for closing remarks.
Well, thank you again for including me in the panel. And I also want to say a special thank you to the Cuban people for the triumph of the revolution for 60 years in the face of unspeakable assaults by the United States, trying to destroy a country that has done nothing other than try to share love and support around the world. There's so much that we can learn from the Cuban example. And I hope that my children, my grandchildren are able to see the realization of the beauty of the Cuban Revolution manifested around the world. Thank you again.
Thank you, Sophia. Kimberly, would you like to share some closing remarks?
I just echo Sophia's sentiments exactly. And then also, if anyone can get the opportunity to go to Cuba to see for themselves, because you get in a state of, especially given the George Floyd now, that there's no hope for a better future. And when you go to Cuba and you see something different, then you actually have a different perspective. and it's a different perspective, especially like I have grandchildren and great grandchildren, and you want them to be in a better place as they grow up, and Cuba actually gives you that hope. It puts hope for the future if we can spread the revolution beyond, the shores of Cuba.
Thank you, Kimberly. Ambassador, would you like to share some closing remarks?
So I just and first of all want to thank you to you all for your unwavering solidarity, not only in organizing this issue to bring this very important topic to the table, but also for the many actions that you're organizing. Some of them you have already announced them. I also want to invite you. I think that the best thing to do is, like some of the panelists have just said, is to travel and see by yourself and to get engaged and get in touch with the people. I think that would provide the best answers to the many questions that people could have. And despite the many difficulties that we could be facing, you might see a society, you might see people vibrant, ready to engage in discussion, ready to engage in the environment of Cuba. I think that is the most important question answer we have for people ready, and people who don't stop at the difficulties, who don't stop at the problems, is still ready to continue pushing to bring the resolution to other to higher levels of realization. I thank you very much to you all for this opportunity and for the very important exchanges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And next, I want to make a big thank you to AISLINN PULLEY. As you all saw, she joined in from her car. She's currently at an action, and so she's not with us here, but we want to thank her and for taking the time to participate and join this important conversation. And next, Professor August NIMTZ, would you like to share some closing remarks?
I think I basically want to echo what everybody has already said, and to express my appreciation to the U.S.-Cuba normalization team for organizing this and providing all of their technical assistance. Again, I can't stress too much the importance of travel to Cuba. You got to go there and see with your own eyes and ears Cuba's reality. You find out Cubans have lots of opinions about what's going on in Cuba, and that's a real eye opener. So again, it's been a real honor to work and collaborate with everybody on the panel who I've worked with before. Hope we can do this again.
Thank you, Professor August. And before passing it on to my co-moderator, Sandy, I wanted to also thank our interpreters. I know myself, I can speak pretty fast, and I'm pretty sure all of us did. I tried to slow down because I understand that our interpreters two of them have been translating this whole time, this webinar from English to Spanish. So thank you to Dwayne Stillwell from Arizona. And thank you to Ana Laura Torres from Argentina. Thank you to both for taking the time and making sure this webinar is available in Spanish as well. And a last thank you is to the organizing groups for this important webinar. I want to thank the Minnesota-Cuba Committee for initiating and organizing this very important discussion, the U.S.-Cuba Normalization Committee, and the Mass Action Coalition to Jail Killer Cops. And thank you to all for joining us. And the virtual mic is all yours, Sandy.
Well, thank you again. I mean, what more can we say? The one thing I will say is there were a number of questions that we couldn't get to because there's only so much time. And so we can clearly continue to have this conversation. There's a lot we can learn about Cuba. There's a lot we can discuss about what's happening in the United States and what needs to happen here. And so this the struggle continues. So thank you so much for attending this webinar.
Thank you very much.
Viva Cuba. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. See you next.
Thank you for having.
Bye-bye. It was great meeting.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you,
Sandy.
everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Total